Komiði sæl. Good afternoon. My name is Hólmfríður Garðarsdóttir, a mouthful for non-Icelanders. I am a professor of Latin American Studies, specialized in literary and film studies, and I serve as the chair of the RIC board, RIC being the Institute for Gender Equality and Difference at the University of Iceland. Today I'm replacing Irma Erlingsdóttir as she is trying to scale down her busy schedule. So I use this opportunity and welcome you to this seminar on gender-based violence, justice and knowledge production in the Nordic region. We are here at the National Museum of Iceland, and today's program is organized around the publication of two books, and we will hear both from authors of chapters from the books and editors. And these books are firstly the Routledge Handbook of Politics of the Me Too movement, and that book was edited by Jithi Sandra and Irma Erlingsdóttir. It was published in 2021. And the second one is Re-Imagining Sexual Harassment, Perspectives from the Nordic Region, edited by Maja Lundqvist, Angelica Simonsson, og Kajsa Vilgren. That book was published earlier this month, so it's right coming from the press, by the Bristol University Press. This seminar is organized by RIC and in collaboration with the Swedish Secretariat for Gender Research and NIC, so it's RIC and NIC, the Nordic Information on Center. And we will start the program with Elín Engström that will come and direct some words to all of us. So Elín, please, the podium is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Hólmfríður, and thank you for the opportunity to host this event together with you at the RIC. So my name is Elín Engström, and I represent NIC here today. NIC, Nordic Information on Gender. We are a Nordic cooperative body working on behalf of the Nordic Council of Ministers. And we are located at the Swedish Secretariat for Gender Research at the University of Gothenburg. And from 2017 and onward, both NIC and the Swedish Secretariat for Gender Research have had several assignments focusing on sexual harassment. Among other things, we have produced policy and research reviews. We have participated in experts groups. And at this very moment, we are administering a Nordic research initiative focusing on sexual harassment at work, which will present results later this fall. And all this long-term work has highlighted the extent and the complexity of this problem. And that gave us reason to take a joint initiative, the Swedish Secretariat for Gender Research and the NIC, to this new Nordic collection on sexual harassment, which will be presented here today. And as a part of the official Nordic cooperation, we are happy to put Nordic cooperation into practice here today. Together, we will join in a discussion with some experts from the Nordic region on this topic. And I have my colleague, Maja Lundqvist, with me here today. She's a senior analyst at the Swedish Secretariat for Gender Research and one of the editors of this Nordic collection. So I will give the floor to you, Maja.
Nope. Sorry. There we go. Yes. Hi, everyone. So my name is Maja Lundqvist. It's always hard to start a presentation without introduction, but introducing yourself. But and as Elín said, I'm one of the editors for this new book It was actually published a week ago, so it's very fresh. And I edited this book together with two colleagues, Angelica Simonsson and Kajsa Widegren. And I'm just going to give you like a short introduction, like some context to this book before we listen to some of the authors. And no, sorry, this is not really the presentation. I can talk without it as well. Yeah, that's the one that I want. Sorry, guys. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Maybe I should stand here. So, as a start, why a Nordic anthology on sexual harassment? Like Elin said, we've been working with, we've been working with sexual harassment and sexual violence for a long time at both the Swedish Secretariat for Gender Research and NIC. But since Me Too movement in 2017, it's been one of our focus areas. And in doing these different assignments that Elin talked about, specifically the research reviews, both on national, Nordic, and international level, we did get quite a good picture of the research field and also the policy development field in regard to sexual harassment specifically. We did get an idea of what kind of demarcations there are around this field, what is taken for granted when studying sexual harassment, and also ideas about how we should and can prevent sexual harassment. We saw that it's a big dominance of research from the US. The Nordic field is very limited, small. There's mainly quantitative studies on using surveys and questionnaires to kind of trying to find the prevalence number, the magic number on how much is it, to be able to say something else from that. We saw that there's a lot of juridical focus in the field, that the juridical kind of definitions and framework sets the agenda for how we understand and work with sexual harassment. We saw that there's a lack of intersectional perspective in the field. There's a lack of diversity in samples in these studies, a majority of them. And we also saw that there's really there's an urge to do something, which is, it's understandable, but the issue with the urge to do something is that a lot of studies, reports, reviews ends with a list of recommendations or ends with a checklist or ideas about policy development or amending laws or juridical frameworks. And this urge to do something was also part of our work. Our reports and reviews also needed to end with a list of recommendations. And this created a frustration for us working with the issue, a frustration about the understanding of sexual harassment that we saw in the field, how sexual harassment was studied, what methodologies were being used, and what we thought what we're supposed to do about it. What are the preventative measures that we could find in this field? So we kind of took this frustration and the knowledge that we had gained about the phenomena of sexual harassment and said that, okay, if we were going to do something else to contribute to this field of knowledge, what could that be? And since we've been working, like Elin said, with the Nordic region for quite some time, we said that it would be interesting to see what the Nordic region and what knowledge about the Nordic region could kind of teach us about sexual harassment, but also what the knowledge about sexual harassment could possibly teach us about the Nordic region. So that was our kind of point of departure for this book. So we thought, why not make a Nordic anthology on sexual harassment? So to be able to do this, we invited contributors, and as editors, and I'm sure as some of you in here know, that as editors you take like 1 million decisions every day, it feels like at least. But I just wanted to share with you some choices and decisions that we made quite early in this process to work with this book. And the first one was that we did not want to focus specifically on researchers in the sexual harassment field. We wanted to let theoretical perspectives, concepts, different methodologies, different empirical material to kind of be included in the knowledge field about sexual harassment. So researchers from the broad gender studies field in the Nordic region were invited to contribute to this book. Another important decision that we made was that we wanted to have a mix of academic and non-academic texts in the book. So we invited also writers and poets to contribute to this book. And this was it has many reasons, but one of them being that experiences and stories and nuances of experiences of sexual harassment is sometimes better described or written about in non-academic texts. And we also thought that these texts could hopefully work as entry points into the book, so that the book can be available and accessible for a wider audience. And finally, we discussed a lot about the Nordic representation. And this is, I mean, we can discuss representation for a long time. I'm not going to do that. But, and the Nordic region, it's a big region geographically. It's a lot of differences between countries and within countries. We have the self-governing areas, Greenland, the Faroe Islands, and Åland. We have Sápmi. So, but we decided that we want contributions from writers and academics, researchers from at least all of the Nordic countries in this book. So now we have 19 contributors in this book. It's 16 chapters, so some of the chapters are co-written. And the book consists of 2 main parts. So part 1 is called Cartography of Everyday Violence in the Nordic Region. Part 2 is called Violence, Knowledge, and Imagining Justice. And the 2 authors that we will listen to very soon, both of their chapters are in part 2. And in part 1, you can read chapters about intersectional perspectives on workplace violence, for example. You can read about experiences of harassment, including sexual harassment in physics departments in Denmark, about sexual harassment in public transport and public spaces in Helsinki. So it's focusing a bit more on the everyday experiences in the Nordic region. So finally, I'm going to share with you 2 reflections or 2 strains of thoughts that has been with us as editors through this work. And the first one here will also maybe give you a hint about the cover of the book. When we asked the publisher to come up with some ideas for the cover, they sent us 7 photos, very beautiful photos about the Nordic region. And these photos, I don't think any of them had a person. It was beautiful pictures, but of the fjords, of the small houses, of the northern lights, beautiful pictures. But we said that, okay, so this is sort of what we're talking about here, the ideas and the imaginations about what the Nordic region is. We were more interested in talking about dirt, so hence this cover. Dirt is a matter out of place. This is a popularized saying inspired by Mary Douglas, an anthropologist. And dirt is a matter out of place means that, okay, so nails is not dirt when it's on your fingers. But if you find nail clippings in your coffee, that's dirt. Hair is not dirt on your head, but if you find it in your food, it's dirt. So nails and hair is dirt if it's out of place. And inspired by Mary Douglas, she also discusses that dirt is something that needs to be kept outside in order to not disrupt the pattern, not disrupt the pure and the clean. Dirt is something that we need to push to the outside. And when we discuss sexual harassment, or specifically the research field and the knowledge on sexual harassment, we said that it's like sexual harassment is treated like dirt, like something that we need to keep outside in order not to disrupt this pattern of the clean, tidy workplace, for example, or the clean and tidy education system, or the clean and tidy gender-equal Nordic region. Sexual harassment needs to be treated as something outside. And we thought it was interesting because, I mean, not least the Me Too movement, but also decades of research and experiences shared by millions of mostly women, non-binary people, is that sexual harassment and violence is not something that's outside. It is more part of this pattern. So we've been using this kind of idea about dirt to discuss new ways and reimaginations of what sexual harassment and violence is and can be in the Nordic region. And finally, I want to share something about what doing can mean. Because this is also, like I said, it connects both to the frustration that I talked about and also to the idea about how to prevent sexual harassment, the urge to do something, to produce knowledge and recommendations and checklists and policy development that can actually do something about this problem. And we thought that kind of connects to the idea of sexual harassment as being separate, as being something else, as being something that you can have your workplace where you have a lot of different situations going on, and then you have the sexual harassment that you're gonna handle it through a policy, for example. And we wanted to use this book to start or continue a discussion on what doing can mean, what it can actually mean to work to prevent sexual harassment and violence. And we started with the idea of we need to reimagine and need to rethink about what sexual harassment is. And we ended in reimagination as practice, as a way of doing. To stay with in this case, the book, the texts, to discuss it, to have conversations about it. So you will not find checklists in this book, but hopefully you'll find other things that can lead to change as well. So yeah, that was very short about the book. And I will now give the floor to Silas Aliki to give a presentation about the chapter. What is it called? I always thought a lot about violence. Yes.
Hi everyone. Thank you all for showing up. Let me know if I speak too loud or too low. My name is Silas Aliki, and I have written one of the contributions to the book in collaboration with the editors. I am a practicing lawyer, and I am also the founder of Sweden's first and only LGBTQI-focused law firm. I work mostly in criminal law and migration law and some social law and family law. And in that role, I represent both victims of crime and people who are suspected of committing crimes. And I also work a lot in asylum law. Previously, I have worked within both the Swedish Armed Forces and the Swedish Prison and Probation Service. So I've been around when it comes to the state. And for those of you who have read my text, you know that I live in a suburb in Stockholm called Akalla, which is a very beautiful area, but it's also very heavily policed and very negatively portrayed in the media. And a few months ago, me and my partner had a few friends over. We were going to watch Snabba Cash. So we had food and prepared to watch the TV show. And suddenly we heard a very heavy banging on the door and the shout outside, "Police." And since I've been to so many trials, I could hear that they had some kind of stuff to bang on the door. And first I got really scared, and my partner and our friends got really scared. But my partner was the first one who was able to get up and go open the door. And there were a lot of policemen coming in. They just pushed her to the side, and they're like, "We're going to search the apartment." And I was still super scared, so I wasn't able to speak up. But my partner asked them, like, "Why are you here? Like, do you have a search warrant? What's going on?" And then one of the police officers told her that we have reports of ongoing child abuse in this apartment. We don't have any kids. It doesn't live any kids on our floor. And from my experience, I also knew that this couldn't be true because they didn't have social services with them. And usually in Swedish law, when you have a suspicion of ongoing child abuse, you don't break up the door. You are a bit more gentle. So they didn't find the allegedly hurt child in the apartment, so eventually they left. And when we all had calmed down from this, we concluded that this was probably a lie. It was some kind of other type of search warrant, probably conducted only because of the address where we live. And to me, this incident that happened this winter is a sign of like the new Swedish reality. Sweden is an increasingly repressive society. As you all know, like decades of neoliberal reforms has rolled back the welfare state heavily in Sweden and replaced it with more and more control and repression. And this has, of course, mainly been orchestrated by the political right, but there has also been some support from some parts of the feminist movement in Sweden. Of course, also heavily supported by the institutional racism that is very prevalent in Swedish society. So in my text in the book, I wanted to discuss how the concept of so-called carceral feminism is linked to the neoliberalization of society and to the increasingly repressive, racist national state that we find ourselves living in Sweden. I used a quote from a professor of sociology, Elizabeth Bernstein, in my text, where she described the concept of carceral feminism as feminist advocacy for a law and order agenda, and a drift from the welfare state to the carceral state as the enforcement apparatus of feminist goals. So in other words, to use feminist movements or feminist concepts to increase repression and control. And this is apparent in some parts of the Swedish feminist movement, not everywhere, of course, but in some parts. This winter, we've seen a number of demonstrations outside courts in Sweden where the demonstrators have called for harsher verdicts or more repression, basically, for sexual violence offenders, of course. And there are also parts of the movement, such as, for example, Fatta, which is a feminist organization in Sweden that has focused their advocacy on more criminalization and longer sentences for sex offenders. Some of the very prominent feminists in Sweden, as I mentioned in my text, has also been calling for tighter immigration policies and more expulsions to combat sexual violence in Sweden. So I wanted to discuss in my text how did we end up in a situation where there is feminists arguing for tighter immigration policies, more expulsions, more repression, more state violence, basically. And I believe this to be the result of the neoliberalization, not only of society, but also of our hearts and minds. I believe that. And as you all know, as researchers, during the past decades, Sweden, especially in the Nordic region, has been subject to like what I would like to call a neoliberal revolution. It's not reform, it's a revolution. Where we have common goods that have been privatized, and probably most notable in the international concept, the so-called market school, which is unique to the world. Sweden is the only country in the world that has this extent of private for-profit schools that we have. And also, the public debate in Sweden increasingly has been brutalized, with now very explicitly racist comments being published in general newspapers. Our migration policies in Sweden are the tightest in the EU, and our current government wants to tighten them even more. And black and brown Swedes, especially black and brown men in Sweden, are often spoken about in the public only as problems. And I argue in my text that carceral feminism, it requires an identification with this state, with this new racist, neoliberalized state to be meaningful. So the argument that I try to make is that the criminalization of sexual violence acts and severe punishments for those, including then expulsion, sends a message that the state takes violence against women, trans people, and children seriously. But this assumes that if this is the main goal for a feminist, it assumes that this is also the biggest need of that feminist movement. The thing that would be most valuable for me would be acknowledgement from the state that something bad happened to me. That's the goal, that's what I need. And many survivors, of course, are in need of vastly different things than acknowledgement from the state, because most people already know what happened to them. I was subject to violence, it was not okay. And I probably need affordable housing, I need a residence permit, I need a higher salary in my job so I can leave this offender that I am now forced to live with, or I need better schools for my kids in an area where I can afford to live. Many of the people that I represent, they are not able to report an offender because they don't have a residence permit, or because they have to make a decision, like if I report him, that it often is, do I want him to be deported? Do I want to inflict violence on this person? Many people decide not to, because when you have compulsory expulsion for a person convicted of a crime, you cut off that person's probably ties to the kids they might have in common. And since we have almost always a re-entry ban in the criminal system for a convicted offender, the person can never come back to Sweden. And this is an obstacle for many people to report violence, because they don't want this man to probably be deported or cut off from the kids. They just want to get out of the violent situation, which is not the same thing. So, in conclusion, carceral feminism serves the person that is not dependent on the redistributive part of the state, only on the repressive part. And I have also argued in my text that because of this, because of the state of Sweden currently, of the repression of the carceral state, the state can also be an even more violent perpetrator than an individual person, because the state has the power to take away your kids, the state has the power to deport you or your family, and the state has the power to look up a person who probably contributes to the family financially. And when the state works like this, automatically, in my experience, it leads to underreporting, because this was not what the person intended. This heavily inflicted violence on a perpetrator or the family is not desired. The only desire is to get out of the violent situation and have support. And that is not possible when the state acts as the Swedish state does currently. And there is also very limited resources. If you do not want to involve the police, there is very limited resources to access for a survivor. I have argued in my text, therefore, that for many, even survivors, the state is the ultimate perpetrator, because the state can inflict so much on your family, as they were preparing to do when they banged our door. And now they found 2 white queers and a white woman behind the door, which I don't think what they expected. That was not what they prepared themselves for to find behind that door. I don't know what they might have done if they have found someone else behind our door. So I argue in my text that prisons and police interventions, the CCTV surveillance that is extremely heavy where I live, body searches, border control, forced expulsions are also part of perpetrator society. And a state that just punishes and doesn't protect is, of course, the neoliberal dream. And I try to argue in my text that we cannot let this colonize our minds as feminists. We need to imagine other futures. We need to imagine a world where both the violence of individuals and the violence from the state is not present in the way that it is now. Yeah, I think that's all for now. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Can you see me behind the podium? Thank you, Silas, for a very interesting talk. I look forward to discussing more afterwards. Right. Yes, so my name is Hilde Fjóla Antonsdóttir, and I'm going to give a talk called Beyond Restorative Justice, Call for Innovative Justice Practices from Sexual Violence Survivors in Iceland. And it's one of the chapters in the book. I have actually given this talk before, last fall, so I hope none of you have to listen to this again. But so, to start with, we've had some current deliberations in Iceland. So the Icelandic, first to give you a little bit of background. So in Iceland, the Me Too movement has continued to make waves as survivors have continued to speak out, particularly on social media, where alleged offenders are increasingly being named publicly. And we have a number of high-profile cases now involving accusations against well-known men in Icelandic society. And these include media figures, musicians, politicians, footballers, and businessmen. And this has very much led to a heated public debate, as many of you probably know, about the validity and consequences of publicly naming alleged offenders. And this is my sense, it would be interesting to hear from the Icelandic audience also afterwards, it's my sense that in this context, restorative justice is increasingly being mentioned as an alternative to public naming of alleged offenders. So this is not necessarily a call from survivors or the feminist movement, but maybe more as a response to something that maybe people will experience as a bit of a moral panic. So, restorative justice. The Icelandic Prosecution Authority does not refer cases of sexual violence to mediation except for minor offenses. I think it's only blygðunarsemisbrot. But in the coalition and government agreement from 2021, it stipulates that applying mediation in cases of sexual violence is to be considered, and now that this work is underway. And therefore, it's important to gain a better understanding of how survivors of sexual violence view restorative justice. So my research question in this chapter so basically the aim of the study is to explore the potential of using restorative justice in cases of sexual violence, and it's based on interviews with 35 victim survivors in Iceland. And the questions are: how do survivors of sexual violence view restorative justice, and how could an alternative justice process meet survivors' justice interests? But the interviews with survivors were conducted between January 2015 and January 2017, so this is before the Me Too movement in Iceland, so I think already maybe this is getting a little bit dated. I think it would be really interesting to continue to do this type of research to understand how things have possibly changed. And then I used thematic analysis to analyze the interviews. So first, to go through some of the kind of feminist critique of restorative justice. Feminists have discussed restorative justice for quite some time, and many of them have been critical of using restorative justice in cases of gender-based violence. First of all, there's the risk of re-privatizing gender-based violence. So the women's movement fought for public recognition of sexual violence and for the criminal justice system to take it seriously. And we can maybe talk more about that afterwards. But the restorative justice is usually a private justice process and often without any public acknowledgement. It can also risk survivors' safety and allows for re-victimization due to power imbalances. And then there's the inability to guarantee offender accountability and responsibility. And the inability to guarantee that community members will be supportive to survivors. And then there's the inadequacy in addressing the broader structural inequalities of race and class in which gender-based violence is indeed embedded. And to quote Kathleen Daly, feminist criminologist, she notes that the standard restorative justice practices require major revision if they are to be victim-focused and appropriate for case of gender violence. So now I want to talk a little bit about, there have been attempts to, and successful attempts to create specially designed victim-centered programs, restorative justice programs. And it was particularly the Restore program in Arizona that was quite innovative at the time. I don't think that's running any longer because of lack of funding. But now there is the project Restore in New Zealand, which is inspired by the program in Arizona. And, but there have been evaluations conducted on these programs, and the findings indicate that these types of programs can meet survivors' justice interests to a degree, in terms of feeling safe, listened to, supported, and treated fairly. But results are mixed when it comes to victim survivors' perceptions of offender accountability. And also, cases are referred to these programs when they are deemed provable at trial, which is, of course, not representative of the majority of cases of gender-based violence, sexual violence. It is important to note, however, that restorative justice has been used independent of the criminal justice system. And there is, for example, an exploratory study of restorative justice conferences by McGlynn and Company from 2012, where they kind of discuss a particular case where there was an adult survivor of child rape and other sexual abuse in the UK. And they kind of followed her case and did interviews with her throughout the process. And she was kind of asked if she would recommend this process to others in a similar position. And she was reported in saying that if a woman was at the right stage in her recovery, sufficiently strong to undertake a conference, and after ensuring the necessary professional support and careful planning, then she should take a deep breath and do it. So there are definitely success stories in this regard as well. Now, to introduce the participants a little better, the criteria for participation was 18 years or over, and self-identify as having been subjected to sexual violence. And I did interviews with 32 women and 3 men They were all white, born in Iceland. I did try to get other kind of groups of people, but I was not successful. So I definitely think more research is needed in this context here in Iceland. And one person identified as queer. And the age ranged between 19 and 67 years. And I'm not going to kind of read all of this, but here you can see kind of the composition of the type of violence that participants had experienced. Often more than one form of violence. None of them had only experienced sexual violence, sexual harassment. So it was all, those who had experienced sexual harassment had also experienced other types or other forms of violence. And the offenders were men and boys, except for one girl and one woman. So, yes, I had a semi-structured questionnaire, but this was a little tricky because generally, as I said before, restorative justice is not used in case of sexual violence in Iceland. And none of the participants had experienced going through such a process. Some were not very familiar with restorative justice, while others were much more familiar with the process. So in the questionnaire, I asked them different types of questions in relation to what the idea of restorative justice is, but I also kind of explained to them the ideology and the kind of concept. And I have that if we want to go into that further. I have a slide on that, kind of how I explained what restorative justice means. And these are the themes that I came up with. And if we start with the first one, which is kind of called Good Idea, but Near Impossible in Practice. So restorative justice is based on the willingness of offenders to want to undergo this process and take responsibility for their actions. And that's usually not the case when it comes to sexual violence. So a woman in her 20s, she said, the first thing that comes to my mind is why would offenders want to go through this? Why? Based on my experience, it's difficult to get offenders, doesn't matter what kind of offenses they have committed, to admit to what they did, let alone to talk about it with the victims and compensate for it. What's the incentive? No, really, I'm asking. Then there's a theme of distrust of offenders. So most participants had no reason to believe that offenders would be willing or have the capacity to participate in such a process and be sincere about it. And a woman in her early 20s said, I think he's a psychopath and that he would never take any responsibility. He wouldn't know what I was talking about. But perhaps it's enough that I tell him what I need to tell him, but I would be afraid that he would think that he was the victim in all this, and then I would be even more angry with him. And I can't be having that kind of energy in my life. And a woman in her mid-20s said, there are so few of them who admit to what they've done. So, I don't know how many would participate in such a process and be sincere about it. I think that's the most dangerous aspect of this process. Then we have the concept here, or the theme, the demand of unjust exposure. So many participants described a deep sense of uncertainty about their own reactions if they were to meet the offender in a restorative justice meeting. So restorative justice meetings demand that survivors expose themselves in return for the uncertain promise of gaining a sense of well-being or a sense of justice. And a woman in her 40s said, I thought restorative justice was a great idea and something I wish people would increasingly use until it happened to me. Now the tables have turned. I wouldn't be able to sit in front of them and tell them how this has impacted me. I just can't. If I would see them, I'm so afraid of becoming angry. I don't know. Perhaps I would just say something terribly ugly. I don't know. Perhaps I would just give them a hug or wish them a good luck in life. I don't know. So there's this kind of fear of not really knowing how oneself actually responds in these kinds of situations. And another woman in her 40s said, you have to go into these circumstances because it's supposedly the way to work your way through the experience. That therefore becomes a demand to expose yourself, which is supposed to be the way through. I think this is damn tricky. Then we have the theme of conflicting processes. So while promptness is considered important when it comes to holding offenders to account, it can take victims or survivors a long time to overcome trauma and gain a sense of re-embeddedness to feel fit to participate in a restorative justice process. So a woman in her early 20s said, today I would be ready to meet with him, but a year ago, no, absolutely not. Before, I wouldn't have been mentally prepared. I hadn't processed the experience. And another woman in her 20s said, perhaps some years later, but still, what is it good for then? I would never have been able to go through this. If he or someone else would have said, can I compensate for this? I would probably have tried to kill the man. I would have just jumped across the table and tried to take his eyes out. You know, at the time, no way. And then there is the offender accountability process. So in most cases, participants neither wish to meet with the offenders nor restore or reconcile a relationship with the offenders. Instead, they emphasized offender rehabilitation for the purposes of holding them to account and increase their capacity to take responsibility for their actions. And a woman in her 20s said, wouldn't it be possible to make offenders undergo some kind of a process like this without the victim? You know, to undergo some form of treatment or counseling while they sit in prison where they have to face the consequences of their actions. And a woman in her early 30s said, I'm talking about a long process, long rehabilitation process, where this twistedness would be tackled. That's what I would want. And then it wouldn't be a court judgment, but he wouldn't be getting off easy either. You know, just go to therapy and say sorry. It would have to be a very professional and very serious. So, and then there is the final theme, societal transformation. So according to participants, the necessary societal conditions entail support and understanding for survivors, as well as creating both societal pressure and space for offenders to take responsibility for their actions, but at the same time without justifying the violence. And a woman in her early 30s said, I understand that his mother loves him. He hasn't denied what he has done, at least not in my case. But I think people have a really hard time with this. As a society, I think we need to develop more on that front. You can be a friend of the perpetrator, but then people have to understand that you can support the survivor by keeping the perpetrator responsible. If you're going to be a friend to the perpetrator, it becomes a societal responsibility. I feel that that's missing. So, just to summarize the findings. So firstly, participants generally did not share the main aim of restorative justice, that is reconciliation and the restoration of the relationship between the parties. Instead, they emphasized the importance of holding offenders to account, offender rehabilitation, and offender accountability. Secondly, standard restorative justice practices usually aim to set up a meeting between the offender and the survivor for the purposes of restoration for both parties. However, participants generally had no wish to participate in such a meeting due to their legitimate distrust of offenders, fear of unjust exposure, and the conflicting processes of restorative justice on the one hand, and regaining a sense of control of their lives on the other. And thirdly, many participants envisaged an alternative justice process where they did not have to meet the offender. A type of offender accountability process managed by professional counselors and therapists. And fourthly, while restorative justice can work in some cases, as other studies have shown, it's also important to look beyond restorative justice and develop innovative justice practices and procedures in line with survivors' justice interests. And then it's changing societal conditions. Since these interviews were taken, the Icelandic context, we have had some changes, I would argue. And we are seeing increased societal support for survivors and increased pressure on alleged offenders to take responsibility for their actions. which is a critical component of creating conditions for alternative justice procedures. But now I think many would also argue that we're seeing a backlash in many respects. So whenever we kind of think we're kind of getting somewhere, there is the backslide. And then, of course, further research is definitely needed to better understand if restorative justice can work maybe better in some cases than others. And that could be both based on survivors themselves, offenders, type of sexual offenses, and other factors. Yes, I think I'm done.
On, yes? Do you want us to? Okay, thank you very much for your presentations. Oops, that's, yeah. So we thought that we were going to have like a dialogue between these two authors. They have had the chance to read their the other chapter before this event. Sorry, what should I do?
Can you maybe hear us? Or is it maybe?
I think it's for the recording.
Oh, it's for the
well.
recording.
Is this better? Yeah? Okay, thank you. Yeah, since the book is a week old, I shared the chapter between Silas and Hildur beforehand, so they've had the chance to read each other's text and prepare some questions or comments to each other. I'm just going to sit here and maybe say something if needed. So we're going to listen to their discussion for something around 20 minutes, and then we'll also would like to invite you all to ask questions or comments or just react to what you're hearing. And after that, we're going to have a coffee break before we meet here again. So I just thought that I'm going to... We just have one microphone now. Yes? Okay. So yeah, I'm just going to give you the mic as a start, Hildur, and if you would like to share some main comment or question or in regard to Silas' text, and we'll take it from there. Okay.
Hello. Yes, I very much enjoyed your chapter. Very engaging and urgent, right? Politically urgent, right? And I thought that you did a very nice job of kind of delivering that urgency, and kind of it was a bit of a kind of, if I understood correctly, kind of a call to the women's movement to beware of the risks inherent maybe in the call for punitive measures as a response to sexual violence, to gender-based violence. But I was wondering, there were kind of some elements there that I was kind of wondering about. For example, you talk about how neoliberal politics and kind of at least certain aspects maybe of the feminist movement, how that kind of came about in, I think you use the concept parallel, that it kind of comes in parallel in the 80s. But I was kind of wondering, how do you conceptualize that relationship between neoliberal politics and kind of the feminist movement? Because off the top of my head, from a Nordic point of view, you would not necessarily put that in, make that connection. So maybe you could say something about that.
Thank you, I can try. So I started writing this text just with the fact that those coincided in Sweden. More calls for repression and punitive politics and the fact that the neoliberalization of Sweden started in the 80s, and it is so currently, as you probably all know, we have a right-wing government in Sweden, which is like the end of this process, basically. This is where we ended up. And I believe that this neoliberalization, as I said earlier, it also affects our power to imagine other futures. Like, we are also creatures in a society, and we, as movements, we are also brought up in societies that tells us all the time that justice is being served when someone is convicted. This is where you get the restoration. This is where you can get closure. And I think it's hard even for visionaries to get out of this cycle, of this loop of repression, punishment, law and order. So I also think that, of course, it's not all parts of the feminist movement, but in Sweden those are quite strong, and those are the parts of the movement that gets most attention. And I think that is because, again, if your strongest need is for the state to recognize what happened, then this is a logical end goal of a feminist organization. But if what you mostly need is, I need a residence permit, then that will never be connected to the conviction. That's your biggest need, and then there will be a small or none connection to the punitive system. And I believe all those things are connected. I'm not really answering your question maybe now, but I believe that they are extremely connected, and that the Swedish society at least have gone through so many changes, and that the racism in Sweden has been so escalated during those 4 decades, that all of those things together contribute to this both unlogical and logical relationship between neoliberalism and feminism that we see in Sweden, I think. So I think that what we need to do is to try to imagine something else, to conceptualize the issue of sexual violence as something that affects a whole life, not only, like, you cannot singularize only the offense. You can do that for some people because that's the only problem that they come across, but for many people it's not. So I think that's the way out. And that brings me to a thing that I read in your text, which I also really enjoyed. It was a quote from one of your respondents where the person said, "We need to create an environment where it is possible to admit what you did." And I think that's also a way out of it, because the punitive process is not that environment. It puts the offender in a position where you will be only the act that you committed. And it's not psychologically, in my experience from working within those systems, it's not a good place of accountability. It's almost impossible, even for a person that might want to take accountability, when you are faced with only the worst thing that you did and it's connected to you as a person. So I was thinking if you could say something about that, if you had discussions or thoughts about what that environment could be.
Yes, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think this is a very difficult one, both, like you say. I think the criminal justice system, which is our predominant kind of, is dominant in our kind of imaginary, political imaginary of justice. How do we create alternative justice practices in the kind of long shadow of criminal law, in a sense? Because it is tricky. Like, how do you, like you said, how do you accept responsibility for violence, without then kind of entering the criminal justice process in some way? And the other question would be, and do we want that? If you commit a very serious offense, and if you just go through a process where you say, I'm very, very sorry, is that also, maybe there's some public interest as well that we need to think about, etc. So I think these are very, very big questions. And I thought maybe I'll just connect it right back to in your chapter how you were talking about transformative justice. Because now that's being discussed quite a lot as a little bit of an answer. I think there's a lot of kind of in public discussion and I think in the literature a little bit, trying to find the solution, the answer to this kind of predicament that we're facing. And transformative justice is definitely, especially among activists and especially in the US context, has been kind of developed within minority communities. But again, of course, in the US context, of course, they're faced with basically by now a totally corrupt political system and a corrupt judicial system. And basically, some argue that they've already entered kind of civil war in terms of modern kind of definitions of that concept. So these are minority communities kind of trying to do things within that context. Here in Iceland, we've had some attempts to do some transformative justice work, especially some years ago. And what happened then, I think, safe to say, and also what has been reported from many other contexts, is that very often, because offenders are so unwilling often to take responsibility for their actions, even if they're not faced with a prison sentence, that what often happens is that communities get divided, right? It's going to split right down to in the middle. So, how do we develop alternative approaches at the same time as we're not going to be doing away with the criminal justice system anytime soon? That's just in a practical sense. So, how do we do that at the same time? Continue to improve the criminal justice system while also finding other solutions. And also, how do we do that without creating different justice systems, right? So for kind of racialized people and minorities, if we're going to create, an alternative system, that's also hugely problematic. So, maybe have you heard any kind of transformative justice examples from Sweden?
So have I heard anything from Sweden? No, I have not heard of official, but I know from both my practice and my life that those are done anyway, because in the queer community, which I am a part of, there are so many discussions on if we know of a person who has committed some kind of violence, there is very often from the person who was subjected to the violence an unwillingness to report because they know that this person will be so hurt by the system, so I will not report them. And then we are faced in the community with dealing with, like, how do we treat this person? How do we believe what this person says? And what are we going to do about it? And that happens a lot, but it's not institutionalized. So it's just when the system is so repressive and so homophobic and so racist and transphobic especially, it still is left, the minority communities are left with trying to create parallel systems anyway, which in my experience is done a lot. And I've been asked to mediate some processes, but that's not what I do. I'm not trained or qualified or skilled for doing this. I'm trained in the criminal justice system. But I think that we also need to talk about, like, the official level, what is recognized and what is out there officially and what is done every day in minority communities. But I also thought about another part of your text that was the fact that you briefly touched upon now, that the criminal justice process is between the state and the perpetrator. It's not between the perpetrator and the victim. And that is also something that many of the people that I represent, they're really shocked that this is not for me. I'm just like a qualified witness, which it is. And the fact that the survivor even has a lawyer is quite recent. Earlier there were no lawyer, they were just left there by themselves. And the fact that they now have a lawyer makes it feel more like that it is about them, but in reality it's not. So
I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more about that. The fact that the criminal justice system is a thing between the state and the offender, basically.
We've actually, here in Iceland, we've been going through some legislative changes, policy changes in this area. So we've been strengthening the kind of legal rights and status of victims in the criminal justice process. Very much looking to Sweden, actually, and Finland, actually, even more. I think Finland is the best in this. To try kind of make sure that the criminal justice system also takes into account victims' interest in this process, especially when it comes to kind of criminal procedure and being able to kind of have a voice in this procedure and have some authority to make decisions as well, and etc. And in Iceland, just before last year, victims of sexual violence, because the courts were closed, because they're considered very sensitive cases. So usually Iceland closes the courts, which means because the victim wasn't a party to the case, they were not even allowed to sit in there, even if they wished for, unless the defendant would agree. So it's quite perplexing. But now their status has been strengthened a little bit, but like you said, it doesn't change the deep structures of law in this regard, and how criminal law is actually conceptualized. Yeah, is there a question? Kind of what we kind of do.
No, but I was thinking, like, still, even if the rights are strengthened for the people who are subject to violence, they are still basically, the role in the proceeding is to be the evidence, the live evidence, and that's not a good starting point for healing, when you're supposed to just deliver a story in the interest of the state, because we've decided that the state, it's important for the state to convict offenders, and I think there might be a gap between what you are told about the criminal justice system. You're told that this is the place for your healing. This is where it can happen. This is where you can have a sense of closure. And then in reality, you're faced with requirements to deliver a story and then leave the courtroom. And what you get from it is a verdict and some money. But yeah, so I maybe if you could expand on if you discuss this in your research with survivors also?
Well, the main thing that came up in my research was this definitely this sense of being kind of on the outside of the whole process, right? With no rights, very little information, the cases take forever, and then usually they're dropped and nothing happens, right? And a very, very disappointing process. And like some would say, you know, this was a worse process than the violence itself. You know, this harmed my sense of justice in a much more profound way than the violence itself. So it's a very serious how the situation is. I think, though, maybe what the criminal justice process does have, but also not just criminal law, but also just what the legal system does have, is this kind of fact-finding element. And I don't think there are a lot of other processes that actually have that inbuilt, right? Restorative justice does not do that. Transformative justice does not really do that. And for many survivors, it's very important to establish what actually happened and what's true, right? And also we kind of talk about a lot, of course, about the importance of healing and closure for survivors. But then there's also the issue of justice. And those two things, very disappointingly, don't necessarily go together. Fighting for justice and doing healing is definitely not necessarily something that goes hand in hand. So that's difficult. And that's also like in restorative justice. You have these different processes which are pulling in separate directions, right? So, yeah, justice is a tricky one.
Can I intervene? Thank you. Because I'm thank you. It's really interesting to listen to. But I'm thinking about this where we kind of started with what kind of society or do we need to build to be able to offer this the possibility for some kind of justice or redress or what we want to call it. And I'm just sitting here, I'm thinking a bit about like the individual focus that's still like in your talk now, that it is like a focus on an offender and a survivor, sort of. But in both of your chapters, you are also talking quite a lot about the community and about the surrounding society. And I just wanted to share from another text in this book by Sumaya Jirde Ali, where she is exposed to sexual violence at a party, and she describes how she comes back into the room and she tells what happened to everyone at this party. And she describes it like, okay, she's looking around in the room and she just tells, there's no culture of silence here. She tells what happened, and she can see how the room is divided into two, and they're starting to discuss what actually happened. And she stands there and she describes it like, is this what I initiated? A discussion after, telling what actually this just happened to me. So I'm also thinking about this, like us as society, our possibilities to hear these stories, to deal with them, to actually listen to them and discuss them and have some kind of preparation for what to do with them when we hear them or when we experience it. And for me, like in my little talk about the how we make sexual violence and sexual harassment as something out there, something committed by this monster, or all of these stories about sexual harassment and sexual violence, I think that also plays into the difficulties in letting the complexities actually be part of a healing process. So in both of your chapters, but I'm thinking for you, Hildur Fjola, about what your respondents think about and in regard to like being part of a community again, because the mediation is about like both the perpetrator and the victim survivor are supposed to be able to be part of the community again, sort of. I guess, yes. Yeah. If you could say something about how your respondents discussed that.
Well, I think also previous research has taught a lot about, when it comes to justice for survivors of sexual violence, that a big part of justice for survivors is to be embraced by their community again. So, right, like you were saying. So there's this feeling, when you're subjected to sexual violence, when you're trying to tell your story, nobody believes you, and you become on the outside of society. But then restorative justice is very much a process that was originally kind of, at least how it has been kind of reinvented in the Western context, this concept of reintegrative shaming. Braithwaite, the Australian scholar, was talked about restorative, developed that theory quite a bit, where the main focus is on the offender. How do we reintegrate the offender into the communities as an alternative to prison imprisonment? So there is sometimes the sense, and also just in the Icelandic context, from our public discussions, there is this fight for who belongs in the community, who gets a place in the community, right? And I've talked about it in other contexts also as a part of my study, this importance of space, right? How space is important for people. And not necessarily like people I talk to, it was not necessarily, I want to engage with the offender and explain to him what happened to me. I don't want to meet my offender. I don't want him to be in the mall when I go to the mall. I don't want to meet him in the cafe I go into. I don't want to work next to him. I want space. So there's this kind of whole concept also, I think, of space and justice, and how do we create that as a society? And then, of course, in Iceland, in the Icelandic context, we talked a lot about canceling culture, and some of us here have written really good stuff on that. Yeah. And there seems, my sense is that kind of the moral panic, if we can say, in the Icelandic context, has very much come about as soon as survivors started to name the offenders publicly. Then I think society kind of set up, and politicians as well, and there was a lot of kind of anxiety around that. And these kind of cases have ended in different ways. In some of them, alleged offenders have had to step down from their positions, not being able to play music or participate in football events and all of these things. But in other cases, they have sued, the defamation cases that we were talking about earlier. So it's very much a complex landscape where the fight for justice is kind of going, from criminal justice into the social justice arena, and it's a fight. And I think at some moments there is a sense that we are getting somewhere, while then at other moments everything seems to slide back. So we're kind of mid-river, I would say.
Okay, I'm just going to open the floor. If you have any questions or comments to Silas or Hildur, just raise your hand and we'll pass you the mic. And if not, we'll keep on talking here for a bit. So yeah, just wave and we'll find you. Yeah.
I was going to just bring up a topic that I've been thinking about, I wanted to discuss with you, both of you, and it is the fact that we are trying to talk about the state as an ally, and I've been thinking about this recently for a few weeks in regards to the chat control, if you know what it is. If you don't know, it is a legislation that will come from the European Union that will monitor all electronic devices, all electronic communication in the EU, all Instagram chats, all WhatsApp chat, everything on Signal, everything. And it is, the EU says that this is to be able to detect child sex abuse. And as a practitioner, of course, I know that those things are going on at Instagram, for example, or TikTok or whatever, but the most serious offenses are not at TikTok. Those are at darknet, or in schools, or in reality. So we have now, the European Union wants to impose on all of us an apparatus of control and surveillance that is more extensive than the one that China has. And they tell us that this is to help victims of child sex abuse. And this is, of course, not, like the state doesn't care about kids that are subject to sexual violence in this way. It's just an excuse. And I think that is, of course, not something that a survivor is responsible for, but it is a responsibility for a movement to discuss when we are interacting with the state and treating the state as a friend. Because the state isn't a friend of everyone, and it's not, the state has many faces. So I wondered if you would say something about this. Not prepared question, but it is interesting, I think, to discuss when we are trying to reimagine how we can deal with those issues as movements.
Oh dear. I hadn't even heard about that. No. Has anybody heard about that?
You're all going to be monitored.
Yeah. Yes, I think, well, like you were saying, I think, yes, here we have. Oh, well, I was kind of saying, maybe the only thing I can kind of say is this notion, which I do think in the Nordic context, there has been, I wouldn't say a love affair between feminism and the state, but definitely much our relationship, even if it's problematic, has been much more characterized by trust than in most other countries. And I'm not saying the feminist movements in the Nordic countries have been blindly trusting the state, but they're very much aim their reform agenda towards the state, right? That is kind of how we try to solve problems, right? Through the political process, through the welfare system. You know, that's kind of the old kind of, or the model, so-called model. But then, of course, yes, an increasingly complicated world where, like you were saying, in the Swedish case, where you have the many faces of the state and not everybody can trust the state. How do we actually navigate this? And what's the responsibility of the feminist movement in that context, right? And how do we kind of navigate that? Yeah, I'm not sure.
No, the fact that the state also is like, okay, I'm going to give you more support, but you will have to pay the price of being monitored 24/7.
Right.
And this, I think, is a sign of what we can expect as movements. When we reach out for support, this is what we get in many cases.
Can you tell me, maybe tell us a little bit more about this? Where does this proposal come from? Like, where does it come from politically?
It is from the European Union. It's currently in the European Parliament, and the goal of this is it's not called check control legislatively, but that's like in the word of mouth. It's called check control, and it is the Swedish Commissioner to the European Union, Ylva Johansson, who is responsible for it. And she has said, if we do not implement this, if we don't monitor every single app on every single phone, the European Union will be a paradise of pedophiles. And it is, I think this is it's so clear what the state does when we use carceral feminist approaches, then that the state is like, okay, you want us to support you. This is what we offer. This is what you have to pay. And I think that is apparent in every, like when the state transforms to a control machine and a repression machine and an expulsion machine, this is what we get. And I think it's that we need to discuss where the state is on its way. Sweden is currently imposing, like every month, it feels like every month, harsher immigration policies, more repression, more surveillance. And when we give power to this machine, it will stab us in the back eventually, because violence comes in so many forms. The state is a very violent construction politically, and I think that once again I keep coming back to this, but we all live with neoliberalized minds. We need to help each other out to get out of this loop of repression and demands for more violence, because it is what it is. If you demand more harsher sentences, it is a demand for violence. And I think that if that is your feminist goal, it's okay. You can demand whatever. Feminism is a big family. You can demand whatever. But what you're demanding is violence, imposing on violence on another person. And as if you are a survivor, of course you're entitled to everything you feel. But I still think that if you demand violence in return for the violence that you subjected, then you have to own that also as a movement. This is what I want. I want the state to commit violence as a response to what I experienced. And this might sound harsh, but this is what I believe, because incarceration is violence. It's extremely violent, and it shuts off the person from their family, from their kids, and so on. Yeah, that was probably not a question, just a reflection.
Okay, I'm gonna, yeah. Hi, my name is Solveig. Thank you both so much for this incredible talk. And my question is maybe a bit fantastical in terms of time, because I'm not going to ask you, Silas, to tell your entire chapter. I have to wait for that. But I was so curious about what you were saying about, the sense and reality of crippling welfare system, and as I understand, the sort of misguided attempt to invite the state in as a response to holding on to the welfare system. A little bit, if you could comment about how this development has been happening. You mentioned, of course, neoliberalism, but a little bit in terms of this, the crippling of so many of our systems, but the state is obviously a different thing as well. Or if you could comment a little bit about this, where we are at the moment in terms of this, yeah.
Of course, I can try. And I am mostly familiar with the Swedish context. And Sweden is, from what I understand, the most heavily neoliberalized of the Nordic countries. The market school is, I think, as I mentioned, is the most apparent example that so many schools in Sweden are for profit, not for students. And we see this in the healthcare system and all those areas that used to be also mostly women working in them. And the more those are taken away, what we get instead with the state money is repression. And in Sweden, our current government has an agreement with the old Nazi parties, Sweden Democrats, called the Tidöavtalet, which is an agreement between the government and the former Nazi party, current Nazi party, where they have agreed on the important policies for government. And this does not include any welfare, basically. A few things, but it's mostly immigration and criminal law. And this affects both the public debate in Sweden, but also the actual legislation. Because last week, the Prison and Probation Service in Sweden said that we will need 10 more prisons to be able to facilitate what this government is proposing. And then this money is taken from something. It's taken from the healthcare, it's taken from childcare systems, and it's taken from the welfare state, basically, because those are also included in the welfare state. The welfare state and the social democratic state was also repressive. It was full of control. So the infrastructure for control is there. It's just a matter of where you put most effort and money. So I think that what we see increasingly in Sweden is it's escalating extremely quickly. And we're building new prisons, we're building new immigration detention centers, but no new schools, no healthcare. We build prisons and detention centers. And of course it is hard because we're all also increasingly caught up and people are having less money, they are worried for friends and family, they have to take care of kids and elders and sick. And it's just, society is just eroding very quickly in Sweden. This is what I see in my job. Like, if people are going to sit forever in prison, that's going to cost. It costs 5,000 Swedish crowns, like 500 euros per day to have a person in prison. It's a lot of money. It has to be taken from somewhere. And it is a priority for the current government. And I think one of the things that we are told about liberal societies is that you're supposed to be free and the state is going to be small. The state is not going to be such a big political entity, but in reality it is. Like, neoliberalization has also transformed. It's become a more conservative monster that was probably not intended from the founders, but now the state is very present. It just does different things. And I think we also need to work, we all know this, we can feel this, we can see this. And we are also being gaslighted in this a lot, because the state is also a gaslighter very often in what it offers. So I think that we need to go with what we know, our gut feelings and what we know about the state and what it does currently, that it is still there, very present, but the hand is not so soft anymore. It used to be, it's more an iron fist than what it used to be.
Thank you. So yeah, we just have a couple of minutes left before coffee break. But I just wanted to ask both of you if you could end with some thoughts about, and I'm stealing this from your chapter, Hildur, the continuums of injustice is something that you write about. And in this book, we discuss sexual harassment and violence as continuums of violence and continuums within life and society, that this is not something out there and something specific. And we talk about, like, where does sexual harassment and sexual violence start and where does it end? Is it possible, like in the juridical system and in the reporting system, you have to be very clear when it started and when it ended to be able to report. And we know that it's very, very difficult to say exactly when the harassment started and exactly when it ended. And so it was just interesting to read the continuums of injustice and thought about, like, yeah, okay, so when does justice or injustice start and when does it end? And is it possible for you to just reflect a little bit on that comment as an end for this part?
Yeah, I have, yes, this kind of continuum of injustice concept. I kind of take this from Liz Kelly, the continuum of sexual violence concept that she coined, and I kind of put it into the context of justice and basically injustice when it comes to kind of cases of sexual violence. So I kind of, conceptualize sexual violence as a form of injustice, and then usually what happens after that is just an increasing kind of unfolds, just different layers of injustices kind of unfold. Especially because people so seldom get any access to any form of justice. And then, like you were talking about, of course, then we can also see the state and the prison system as another form of injustice. So even if you do get some form of justice there, it could also kind of be understood as a form of injustice in another sense. So yes, I think the continuum concept can kind of, can maybe have a lot to say on different levels of this. But yes, I think I'll just end it there.
Do you want to say something on that? No? Okay. Any last question? No? Otherwise, we'll have coffee now, and you can please talk to us at the coffee break so we don't feel alone. Thank you.